Welcome to the Innovators Breakfast. The topic of today's session is going to be failure, which is a big looming thing that we all have to experience and we all have to deal with. And it's something that in my conversations with people, whether that's clients or just the virtual coffees I have or in-person meetings, it's one of the common themes that always pops up in terms of like, everyone talks a good game about failure and everyone understands that we need to embrace failure, but very few people actually get to experiment with failure and actually fail, which I find to be a really interesting thing. And that's why I wanted to create this session, and ideally something beyond that, where we basically create a sandbox for failure, where we get comfortable with failure. We can experiment and explore why we fail, what lessons can be learned from it, and actually actively try and seek out failure as opposed to success. And for those that are new to the Innovators Breakfast, welcome. I think we've got a few new faces. That Matt's joining us for the first time. Tatiana, have you joined these before? I know we've done INSO stuff.
No, only together with you where we had a few chats.
Yeah, we've got Reese, who's new, who's a good friend of mine. Amir, have you been on these before, or we just connected? Yeah, okay, yeah. So we got some new faces. The way we always kick these meetings off, and I try and aim for about 45 minutes, but with a slight fudge factor of 15 minutes. So again, please feel free to drop off if you need to. I normally do a bit of an icebreaker where we kind of get to kickstart the conversation, but also introduce ourselves. So I'll go first to lead the way. And what I do is I kind of finish it, and then I'll nominate someone else. So whoever I nominate, do your piece, and then please nominate someone else until we've got everyone on the call. And if you've been left out, please let me know. I have shared a whiteboard link. Feel free to use that, but again, I'm not going to be overusing it. It's just a place for you to add notes and ideas and comments as the conversation goes. But again, please feel free to just jump in on the conversation. Don't need to micromanage it by raising hands. Just have a normal conversation as if we were all sat in the room. So the icebreaker today is basically sharing a failure. And for me, oh man, I failed on pretty much my first business venture, which was a fishing product. I invented a fishing product. The engineer in me just wanted to prove that I could build it, and I got so heavily invested in the build phase that I forgot to look at all the basics around it. And for me, that basically wasted a whole load of my time, a whole load of money that we'd poured into the project. And damaged some relationships with people that were fairly close to me. And it was a sense of naivety on my side. I was excited, having thought I'd invented the next best product. And these are all lessons that I've learned through trying other things since that, but also what we're doing at INSO. So for me, that was a huge lesson for me in failure, and the importance of not jumping into the build phase where you can just go down a rabbit hole, and the sunk cost fallacy and all that sort of stuff. So that's my exposure to failure that I'd like to share. I'd actually like to let's go for Tatiana next.
It's a very tricky one for me. And as you were talking about it, I was just reflecting. And I have to admit that I was struggling to find a failure, not because I never failed, but because I guess I was lucky enough to reframe it early enough in my head into lessons, just learning certain lessons, just iterating, trying things. So what came to my mind is really like early on when I was working with people. And again, I don't want to call it a failure because in my head, it's just a lesson. But my assumption was that the best thing is like if you know something and then you can act as a mentor, then you can help them to basically achieve certain results faster. What I did not realize back then, that what worked for me sometimes would not work for them because they would be different. And so later on, it helped me to understand that actually sometimes mentoring approach is not working with people. Probably that's why I became a coach as well, is really that you need to dig a bit deeper and to understand who's in front of you and what is that approach, that is the approach that will be working for them. So that is kind of my lesson. And again, I don't want to call it a failure, but it was my lesson that sometimes it just doesn't work with certain people because your way is not always the right way.
Thanks, Tatiana. Who's next?
Stefano, you want to go next? Just because I see you here in front of me.
Yes, yeah, no, sure. No worry. Me and Tatiana know already from previous meetings, so this is why we saluted each other. And good morning to everyone. So excluding the personal failure, which I think is a separate chapter, and without mentioning necessarily one product or initiative, I think that overall, the failures I had in my marketing career, they all relate to the fact that when decisions were taken based purely on financials or short-term goals, leaving what's really needed by the people behind, or decisions to accelerate activities just for the sake of following a competitor that launched a product, and then, oh my God, we need to be there as soon as possible. I don't care if the product is suboptimal. The important is to be there. So they were not the right insights. They were not the right understanding if what we were doing was fitting with our brand, would have been understood by people, would have been enoughly supported. So in essence, very tactical, and therefore short-term, short-sighted. To me, that has been clearly the recipe for failure. And despite I understood it along my career, I was surprised how companies or sometimes decision makers keep failing in understanding failure, right? Like they insist in pursuing some activities because, again, sometimes the short time decisions prevail versus a long-term strategy. And sometimes it's good, but most of the time, especially when you talk about product innovation, I don't think is the right way to operate.
Perfect. Thank you. Who's next?
Oh, I will leave the mic to Doug. Hi, Doug.
You need to unmute. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Technology. Yeah, it's great to learn from your mistakes, but it's even better to learn from somebody else's. And so I feel I can provide a service in that area because I've lived quite a long time and made a lot of mistakes that I can share. One in particular was I met a guy. I'd organised some successful events in the UK, but I met this guy from Saudi Arabia, and he wanted me to organise an event for him out in Saudi Arabia. And I lined up speakers, planned the program, and then he just suddenly stopped communicating. And I was just on the point of booking hotels and airline tickets, and he just didn't reply to emails. And I've had a few other things where people have just suddenly stopped, and there's absolute rats out there. You know, it'd be so easy for them to say, "Look, I'm sorry, but you know, we can't go ahead. My source of funding didn't materialize, or whatever." But not to just leave somebody hanging and potentially putting more good money after bad. And so I'm very sensitive when people don't reply to emails in a timely manner, because I think, you know, is this it? And they're just not going to tell me they've changed their mind, they want to do another project, or are they just busy, or have they forgotten? So it's all about communication. So make sure people communicate and that they understand the importance of it. But I've got some examples that I could give but I wouldn't want their names to go out because they're the sort of people I wouldn't trust to.
I think trust is an important part, and I assume trust is going to come into why we create environments that allow people to fail. Trust, I think, is a huge element to that. So, who's next, Doug?
Reese.
Thank you, Doug. Good to see everyone. Good to meet everyone for the first time. So I've got two quick ones. One is a personal one, and one is a more sort of professional one. I guess recently, as a proud Welshman, I attempted to learn Welsh as a second language. And I think the parameters within which I sort of set myself learning that language set me up somewhat to fail. And as Tatiana was saying, it gave me a lot of learnings for how, when I attempt to do it again, I can make those changes. And I'm not currently living in Wales. I'm not surrounded by people who speak that language. I was learning online remotely, and I just learned that those factors all contributed to it being very difficult. So next time it's really about immersion and face-to-face contact. I think I'm going to need that if I am going to succeed. I think the second quick one, I think from Dan's intro, what I really got thinking about is we often think about failure as, we're trying something new and we might succeed or we might fail. But actually in a professional context, for me at the moment in my organization, it's actually failure of a product after years, even decades of success, and how we sort of deal with going from something that was very successful as a model, and due to macroeconomic changes, all externalities, actually that product then starts to fail for reasons that are somewhat out of our control, but then how it can be very challenging to adapt to those new environments, particularly with the product that we have. So as you start to tweak the core offer, it becomes devalued in the eyes of your original customer. So it's almost as if you then need to go and find new customers and new people to engage with. So yeah, I guess it's just that idea of dealing with and potentially needing to accept failure after a long period of success.
I love that. It's like failure is almost an inevitable part of anything's life cycle, right? Anyway, who's next, Reese?
Estelle.
Hello, everyone. So I think mine's a little bit different because the failure that I have in mind is, so last year I went through the whole process of learning to drive, and I failed my first driving test. And basically I had like a perfect drive, and then I failed in pretty much the last 5 minutes. I just stupidly pulled out of a junction when I shouldn't have done, and I basically knew what I was doing wrong. But I think I was so like obsessed with being like, I need to pass. Like, I don't know if you know the landscape at the moment of driving tests, but there was like at least a 3 months waiting list to get another test in, if you could get one at all. Yeah, so I think I was just like, oh, it's going fine, it's going fine. But then I was like, okay, I need to stay in the game. But then I just didn't, and I basically ruined my chance for that. But I think from that I learned that failure is feedback, and not to be so obsessed with the outcome, but kind of like relax and think of the process, I suppose. And then, yeah, for the next test, I passed, and it was completely fine. And I feel like I really learned from that experience. And I actually really enjoyed the second test that I did, and I had a really great time because I was just like, let go of the outcome and just, do what I know I need to do. Yeah.
That's awesome. I actually failed my first driving test too. And thinking back, when you said that, it reminded me of like, that's probably one of the biggest tests in my life that I've been the most nervous for, which is bizarre. Anyway, sorry, next person.
I would like to pass it to Louis.
Perfect. Hopefully everybody can hear me now. Thanks, Estelle. In terms of failure, I think I'm going to put a different sort of spin on things. I think it's really important to fail, and I think it's really important that youngsters fail, particularly as they're going through not just formal education, but as they're going through. I think we live in a society now where people are actually afraid to fail, which is therefore meaning that people are afraid to take risk. And if you're afraid to take risk, that means that we then don't grow. So I've failed all the way through my career. I remember failing one accountancy exam for ACCA, and as I came through the Big Four as well. So the pressure on your exams, you've only got 3 attempts, and then if you fail, then you don't have a contract anymore. luckily, that didn't then happen again, and I passed and got a nice little bonus at the end. But I think I've seen failure also eat people alive. So they fail one exam, then they get into a bad track, and then eventually they fail the second one and the third one just through pressure, not necessarily through competence. So I think it's really important to teach failure, and also teach the coping, not just coping mechanisms, but kind of thinking that obviously the point of learning came up, but I think also why I'm failing. So it's not necessarily meaning an education thing. It could be a pressure thing. It could be a home environment thing. So I think that's my 2 cents in terms of failure. I think it's not just necessary. I think it's really important, and it's something that we shouldn't shy away from, particularly as a wider topic around society, where life is not straight. It's not a straight path. It's very, very all over the place. And I think the more people recognise that life isn't linear and isn't necessarily the most academic route, I think the better. So I think that's my 2 cents, and I look forward to the further discussions. I'm going to nominate Leslie.
Hi everyone. Yeah, lovely to be here and lovely to meet you. It's wonderful listening to all of you, and Louis, I probably I fall more into your camp in terms of failure being essential for growth and for learning, and especially the way that we look at failure. I have failed multiple times in the past. Probably some of my biggest failures. One of them was when I failed my first year at college, purely because I was enjoying myself a bit too much, and completely failed. And I redid it, and that was fine. But where I have failed in life, and actually I think I mentioned to Dan recently that I don't feel like I'm failing enough at the moment. I'm not taking enough risks. But where I have failed, I've found that the reflection and also the honesty of that failure has put me in a really good position, probably a better position than what I would have been before. So, for example, with failing my year at college, I went on to apply for a scholarship with a company and win a grant. And they asked me outright, they were like, well, why have you spent 3 years, at college when it's only a 2-year program? And I was just like, yeah, I failed. I absolutely fucked up. I was enjoying myself too much, but actually it kind of gave me that realization that if I want to get on in life, then actually I've got to put the effort in, and that's what I did, and I grew from that. My background with what I do, I work with leaders, coaching. I'm a leadership coach. I look at coaching culture within organizations, and one of the biggest fears there is that we shouldn't have failure within our organizations, and often we find that leaders aren't giving their teams opportunities to fail, which creates an enormous amount of pressure for the leaders themselves, because they feel like they need the answers and that they need to always have the right solution. But I feel like it is not giving people the opportunity to really grow, because I know that certainly for myself, actually my biggest growth has come from all of my failures through my professional life and also my personal life. So that's where I stand on the subject.
Amazing, thank you. And I think Matt's still to go, and I think that's everyone.
Can I go now, because I need to drop
sorry, you should have gone first. Yeah, sorry, Matt. Yeah.
No, that's Amir, because I have a customer call in 5 minutes, so I'll need to drop. So unless you want to miss my failure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Sure. So I failed, like many here, I failed a lot. One that came to mind is, I was director of products in a startup. I was not able to, after a year and a half, I realized I was not able to make the new product that we were doing penetrate into our target audience, which was enterprise. But I think, again, touching on some of the things that people mentioned, right now I'm in a very different mood. And an example that I can use is, with the tools that are out there now, vibe coding, AI tools, I fail a lot, but then I've learned to revert. So I build something, I put it out there, I get feedback, and I think the one thing that I've learned is just ditch whatever I've built, because otherwise I'm just wasting time. So I've learned to quickly understand, okay, when is this a failure, and not dwell on it, and then start a new thing, a new experiment.
Amazing. And sorry, Matt, I thought I was talking to you earlier. Amir, thank you for that. And yeah, I think that's really important. And there's actually a different theme I'm thinking about here a lot about in terms of like what's disposable these days, given tools like, vibe coding and stuff. Is disposable tech now a thing, and how's that going to impact us? But anyway, yeah, thank you so much. And I think, Matt, then you are the final person to go.
Oh, thank you very much, Dan, and everyone for sharing. That's great. Just for background, I run a small software company. We've got half a dozen people all writing software and doing various things like that. Reflecting on where we failures, I'm historically a particularly stubborn person. I do a lot of endurance events where I don't like to admit defeat, even if that's on the cards, and so I tend to just push my way through and get to the end, which itself may be something to think about whether that's a failure. But from a business and sort of innovation sense, I could certainly give some examples of where we went into a market with a product which we just didn't assess it properly. We didn't review the market. We went in, we missed the boat. We made all sorts of mistakes. But for the most part, we've managed to pick up on those and sort of pivot at some point or another and not turn it into an absolute dumpster fire or whatever. But I guess the thing that I've taken away from that is we've always talked quite a good game about fear of failure being a good thing, and we should embrace failure and take it on. But I think we haven't necessarily always walked that path in what we've done, and actually we've been quite cautious. And I think cautious is okay, because obviously you have certain responsibilities and a certain way you like to run your business and do the things you want to do. But when I reflect on some of the decisions we made, where I think we have failed is, if we take the easier path, which we know will sort of give us certain results, I think there's a risk of failing to stay true, say to what's important to you or to your values. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that we've that I reflect on having failed over the years, which is sometimes you have to make that decision to say, what, that would be a great thing for us to do, but it's not actually where we want to be. And if you do it anyway, then I think that's a bit of a...
Great. Thank you, Matt. And I think that segues nicely onto what I wanted to cover next anyway, and it's been brought up. And I think like Louis' point there was like essentially the crux of this call, right? It's like, I kind of another question to the group, and no in particular order, just go. But like, has anyone actually worked or been in an environment where failure is, there's been like dedicated space carved out for it? And I don't know whether you can call it like a sandbox or like a dedicated research department. Like, I'm drawn to kind of science in itself being like a failure laboratory where you have to try different things in order to try and find the thing you're trying to find. And sometimes you find things that you don't intend to find, but that only comes from having the fear or the space to fail and the no fear where obviously a lot of this is driven by budget. So it comes back to, I think, Stefano's point about, in reality, we only have a limited amount of time, we only have a limited amount of money. And to Matt's point, we have obligations to do right by the organizations and the people that are involved in those. So has anyone actually had a good exposure to failure through any projects or work or environments or anything? Yeah, Doug.
I used to be, well, still am a physicist, but I used to work as a physicist. And there, as you mentioned, you try things out not knowing whether they're going to work. And that's the sort of essence of it. And worked in medical physics, and we tried all sorts of things that we didn't know whether it was going to lead to a dead end or something useful. There's one tip from that, though. My boss there created relationships with lots of medics and that. But before embarking on something, when somebody said, "Oh, I'd like to try using ultrasound for this," he'd get them to do something first. So say, "Well, can you do a literature search and let me know what you find," or something like that, to show that they're actually keen. Because sometimes you go off and work on something and then go back to the person who suggested it, and they're no longer interested. It was just a passing remark. So that's one way of avoiding failure. If you do collaborate with somebody, make sure they are actually genuinely interested. But it's a great environment though, a scientific one, where it's just part of the ethos that you try things out.
Yes, fun.
What's going to happen?
Yes, let me lower my hand. Yeah, I was very interested in the conversation today because I feel like the word failure is still a very scary word. And I think there's not real honesty about it. To me, the big question is, we all say failure is inevitable, is good, okay, but do we really believe that there is a culture of failure installed and in where we work and where we live also, no? And can we start from big societal points where today it seems like the more muscular, the more authoritative you are, and no opening to any failure seems to be a winning model. But now, without talking about geopolitics, in the world I come from, the companies, like everybody say, yes, fail fast and learn fast, but do we really believe that we know what to do with failures? To me, that's the question. What do we do with failures? What do we do with the learnings of the failures? Is there a system in our organization that is ready to digest, embed, even promote failure in a sense, in order to once again learn fast? And lately, I've been speaking with a lot of coach, career consultants, and recruiters in the last 18 months. In the end, all our stories have to be about success. I hear very lately the suggestion to talk about, yeah, if you want to talk about failure, yeah, it looks like more genuine, but then be sure that you immediately switch to a success, right? Because in the end, it's normal. It's what people want to buy. They buy you for succeeding, not to fail. So once again, how do we embed the concept of failing in a positive stories, and how we really metabolize it, as part of life, as part of success for longer term? I think to me, there is a bit of, if not hypocrisy, still there is a long run to go before we really accept, apart from this small context we are today, that failing is much more frequent than succeeding, right?
It's interesting to me when you said that, you actually sparked a bit of a paradox in my mind. As human beings, we tend to be drawn to the negative more. It's why the news is always negative, right? But then to your point, Stefano, we preach a positive narrative in certain other aspects. Like, arguably, we should be, as human beings, drawn to failure more and the lessons that learn from it. Why is it that the news is negative but LinkedIn is positive?
I don't know. I think that, once again, we live in a world where we need positive reassurances, and LinkedIn is a showcase for people also to show what they do. And normally what makes you win is show your successes again. So you want to sell, horrible word in this context, but you sell what you have done positively. I wonder if people will start saying, hey, this is what I say more frequently, this I've done is terrible, or the results are terrible, but that's what I've learned, right? Start sharing more of these. Would you ever hire somebody that comes to you and your LinkedIn starts showing a lot of failures, but then at the end something also positive out of it? I don't know. I don't have a full answer to that. I'm just realizing that our everyday life is a constant list of failures with momentaneous successes. Like, I'm a big tennis fan, and Roger Federer said, in my life, I won a lot of games, but to win a match, you only win 53, 55% of the points. It's not that you win all the time. And actually, it's to me, it's very true. But apart from some buzzwords, I feel like people are still, when decision makers are still really looking for quick wins and people that can deliver quick wins.
I suppose to Dan's point there, that the whole LinkedIn side of things, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because people historically don't want to admit where they've gone wrong or made a mistake. And if all you ever see is people on LinkedIn talking positively about all the success they're having and how they know X, Y, and Z about all the things. So, you know, you're going to make it harder and harder for people to talk openly, honestly about their failures. But Stefano, to your earlier point, which was really hit home for us, is we're a small business, and we feel like we actively encourage failure. We want people to come in, innovate, try things, just do it, and if it goes to shit, then we don't care. You know, that was honestly the culture we thought we were trying to cultivate. But someone left the business a couple of years ago, and one of the reasons was that they felt that although that was spoken, perhaps we weren't really living it. You know, as in they felt they didn't have that bandwidth to try something. You know, what if they failed? What if it went wrong? What if they spent a week building something and it didn't work and we threw it away? And we were like, well, no, that we encouraged that, but clearly we hadn't put that across to people in the right way. And so I guess there's the question that, you know, is, you know, how do you establish that culture of it's okay to fail, the fail fast stuff? You know, and I think that probably has to come from, you know, top down, which is going to vary considerably based on the size of your organization. You know, we're very small. You know, does that work in your 1,000-man organization? I don't know, but certainly for us, it's important that us as business leaders, we go out there and we're quite happy to screw it up and tell everyone about it.
Yeah.
There's a couple of hands raised. Jump in, guys. Just go.
I just wanted to share, because, you know, we mentioned the overall environment of kind of scientific type of profiles, and I recently called out a workshop in Bayer, and as we know, in pharma, they fail like pretty much over 90% of times, if not over 99% of times, right? So whenever they work on developing these new molecules, and you would think that when you come to the R&D guys, that those people are really used to fail, and it's kind of normal, and it's totally fine for everyone, because that is kind of the way how they work. But what was very interesting is the observation that actually for people who were there, and there were multiple leaders from R&D, actually for many of them, it was totally not okay. And it was absolutely uncomfortable. And it was actually very depressive, the fact that, you know, they have to fail so many times. And when we looked at the, basically, you know, at the model that is like really insights profiling and looking at the colors of people and seeing if there are any patterns and if there are some people who are actually like perceiving these failures better, it was very interesting to see that the yellow color, right, like the one who is like more kind of social, optimistic, positive, those people were the only ones really who would be cheering up everyone else pretty much and say like, guys, it's okay, you know, let's keep on going, let's try more, let's fail more, because the more we fail, the faster we will come to some outcomes that actually will work out. So this is to the point that it's very interesting to see that, also like to observe in the teams which kind of people there are and which kind of leaders you have, right? And who is driving this whole thing, because maybe this is also something that we can learn to make sure and to find ways to have more of those people who are more comfortable with this type of failures. So that was an interesting example from an environment where you think that kind of failure is a norm.
Yeah, I was going to ask, actually, I got a question on here, like who does failure well? And that's really interesting that they fail a lot but still don't do it well. Anyway, Leslie, you've been waiting very patiently.
Yeah, no, what I just really wanted to add, I mean, first of all, this goes right back to, I think it was Amir's point earlier. I think we need to give ourselves grace when it comes to failure, because actually I think as a society we have been, I mean, certainly where I grew up with the education system, it starts from a very small age. We are conditioned to see success as being celebrated, and you know, and I think with the instant gratification now of social media, etc., you know, there is that conditioning of I need to be best, I need to have that competitive edge, I need to have something that's absolutely incredible. And you know, even from a point of, you know, you would only ever put your hand up in class if you had the right answer, because actually if you didn't have the right answer you get laughed at. You know, your teacher says no, that's not the right answer, you know, and for older people I'm sure, you know, it's like you dummy. And so I think there's a social conditioning, first of all, that's, you know, very ingrained in individuals. And as leaders, we need to role model But we also have to create an environment of psychological safety. It is okay to fail. And actually, I trust you. You know, this isn't, again, it comes down to, you know, for example, you know, when we have policies, and those policies, you know, they look great on paper, but actually, is anybody really doing them? Because we know that at the end of the year, actually, the numbers are going to be the only thing that people are looking at. They're not actually looking at, oh, well, you know what, Matt, you spent, you know, all of this time building something that didn't actually work out, but what an amazing effort. And we're this much closer to actually finding the right solution. So it does come, I believe it does come down to us sort of rewiring ourselves in some sense, and actually letting go of the shame that is already embedded within all of us around what failure actually is. Because I think we're all agreeing that actually failure can have a positive effect. You know, it can help us move forward, it is seen as learning. But actually, if internally we're still dying inside and we're not given the opportunity to express it and for it to be seen, not necessarily positively, you know, if we've messed up and it's had a huge impact, that, you know, that does have consequences. But actually, if we're safe in that environment, it makes it easier. And I just want to share a story, actually, it's of a moment where a leader was very honest, and it was a big failure for our business, really. Not the business I'm with now, but a business I was with a little while ago. And the business was failing to the point where they didn't actually think that they were going to be able to pay salaries. And our CEO actually stood up at the time and spoke to everybody very, very candidly and openly in the office, and told us, you know, we don't think we've got enough money. You know, if we carry on like this, in 3 months' time, we're not going to be able to pay you salaries. And I thought that was hugely brave. And actually, the impact that it had on all of us as individuals was, how do we find a solution for this? And I'm not saying, you know, all suddenly start bringing more money in. Actually, it was, okay, well, can we pause our pensions? Can we do this to save each other? And it had a really positive effect on how we continued as a business. And actually, we did end up being able to pay salaries, and the business continues today. And I genuinely do think it is because we had that open and honest conversation. And if it had just been swept under the rug and then a decision had been made, or, you know, I genuinely think that business would have collapsed. And so I guess that's just a sort of story of that openness, you know, towards others.
Yeah, I love that. I think, like, yeah, there's something what you said there chimes with something I really believe in as well, is that we innovate faster in times of crisis, but it does require good communication and honesty. A perfect example of that. Reece, yeah, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, just going back to your sort of secondary question there, Dan, about experiencing sort of environments for failure. So from my introduction, so I work at the Big Issue Group in the UK, which some of you might be aware of from the Big Issue magazine. And we're set up to address poverty in the UK and support people living in poverty and give them the opportunity to, you know, work their way out of poverty and prosper. But the historical way we've been successful at doing that, we'd start to see sort of tailing off through print media. You know, print media as a whole industry is falling away. So we had a new CEO come in during COVID pandemic, and he was fantastic at that, really. Yeah, he's really strong and demanding, but he really gives the space to experiment. And he set up something that he termed Big Issue Ignite, which was really just a space for anybody to bring ideas that could be tested as, you know, real minimum viable products, you know, real quick, short, sharp pilots that we could really get a sense of, is this a potential future product? And we went through ideas around selling kombucha, which failed very quickly, around, you know, taking waste clothing and recycling that and training people with the skills to do that recycling and then selling that as a new product, and that failed very quickly. But all of those failures got us to, we were trying to support people who were unemployed. And what all of those failures sort of taught us was those individuals need a lot of direct hands-on support to get them ready to then move into employment. And that all brought us to the idea of setting up a recruitment service which worked intensely one-on-one with people who have been unemployed for more than 6 months. And that was, launched as Big Issue Recruit, and that's now going from strength to strength in its 3rd year. It's partnered with sort of national and multinational organizations, and we're supporting those organizations to fill their employment gaps, but also drive social impact by bringing people who are long-term unemployed into the labor market for the first time, or for periods of after 6 months or more. So it was all really thanks to our current CEO coming in and identifying that problem I mentioned at the start of our biggest revenue driver is starting to tail away, and we need to fill that gap. And it was really allowing anybody to come along with an idea, pitch an idea, and then have a core team come around that idea and launch, a really short, sharp pilot, as I say.
That's a great example. And yeah, I mean, I wonder if there's anything to do with the fact that the organization is a charity in its sense, coming back to Stefano's point about short-term goals that are driven by immediate financial reward. I wonder if there's anything that the organizational deeper psychology and purpose allowed you to create that sort of sound.
Actually, something around, sorry, I forgot to say, around that financial aspect, obviously hearing a lot of people talk, and I always come back, taking a risk usually brings a financial burden, or when we talk about risk, there's usually a financial risk attached, and lots of people aren't in a position to be able to do that. And what we found actually through all of those pilots was trying to joint venture, trying to share that risk with another like-minded organization. You bring in additional resource, you bring in additional thinking and ideas, but there's also the opportunity to potentially share that financial risk.
I'd like to learn more about that. Let's chat offline, actually. There's been a really interesting case study for some stuff I'm pulling together. I'd also like to welcome Aslam onto the call, who is, we're actually going to be launching in INSO Education Reimagined series. And I think there's a lot of crossover here. So I'll be making sure that everyone on this group gets a link to that. But Aslam, just introduce yourself, please. And all we did as a basic icebreaker at the start was just share a personal or professional failure, maybe some of the lessons you've learned from that. You're on mute. Is it just me, or is he on mute?
No, I think he's off mute, but I think maybe his audio is not working.
Yeah, audio is not working, Aslam.
How's that?
Yeah, we got you. Bit of an echo. It sounds like you're in a concert hall, but let's go.
So I just finished my my Year 9 class, but I'm born and raised in London, and I wanted to try something new. And I thought, what's education like in the international field? So I came out to Qatar, and I've been here for 11 years now. And while I've been here, I've had the opportunity to will take these off. So I've spoken at various conferences that have happened in Qatar, and it's been a great opportunity to share my ideas. I'm a big fan of tech in classrooms, and when COVID happened, we were suddenly forced to use Microsoft Teams and all sorts of things, and I think that was a step forward. I think there's great ways of using AI within education, in meaningful ways, and I present on that. And I look for like-minded people that I think every problem, and I think this is true in life as much as it is in education, every problem we face can have a creative solution. If you think hard enough, and Dad and I have spoken about this, that every problem we face, you can find a creative solution to it if you look hard enough, whatever it is. So a failure within somewhere where I've encountered failure, I think that I say this to my students, that failure is not failure if you learn from it. If you can draw a lesson from something that's gone bad, then it's not a failure. It changes from a failure to a lesson. So, and I try to live by that. So I wrote a book, and I struggled to find a publisher for it. every publisher I approached, they turned it right down. It was a book called Teenage Survival Guide. It's a guidebook for teenagers how to navigate being a teenager, and I was struggling to find a publisher. And so the lesson I drew from that was that it's a very congested market. And so what I did is I thought, I did aim high, then I looked a bit closer to independent publishers, and I found them and had to really pitch the book, and eventually almost getting it published, but they weren't sure if the drawings and the content was AI. I said, well, the drawings, I had to get my artist to prove that he's actually drawn the cover, and to prove that the content is actually based on my life. So that was another hurdle as well. But after that, we finally got it out there. So I think that perseverance is very important, you know, in anything. Perseverance is very important. Not giving up, but also when you approach failure, how do you take it? You are going to get hit by the failures that when you try and do something, you know, out of the norm. What do you do with that? Do you let it take you down, or do you instead stand your ground, be a little bit flexible? Because if you're inflexible, that's a problem. Because then it's you and a wall. But I think if you can be a little bit flexible, then a little bit malleable, and be open to other options, then you can circumvent that failure, and you'll find another avenue.
Thank you for sharing that. I think this conversation flies by. I'm conscious of managing time. In the last 10 minutes or so, I guess really, how do we take all this conversation and culminate it into something that we could tangibly do tomorrow? Like, that's what I'm all about, turning ideas into action. Like, you know, what is it, if we were going to blank canvas failure and start again? I mean, like, how do we encourage this from the roots up? You know, how do we embed a culture of failure into education, which in theory would then move into people's professional lives and beyond? I mean, what things could we do? I mean, taking Reese's example of creating a designated space, you know, taking other examples from people's lessons, you know, Matt thinking he had the right culture, but not maybe enacting that, and his staff didn't feel it. You know, how do we build a genuine, authentic space and a culture that underpins that, anyone operating within that space, to make it realistic and beneficial? And like everyone else has said, learn from that.
Start from a business accounting point of view, start a failure fund accounting line, right? That you have a designated amount of funding every year that can be written off against sort of failed ideas, failed projects, so that maybe that financial risk doesn't hit quite as hard or isn't quite as unexpected, and you can plan a little bit more for what your failure appetite might be.
What's that Prince Philip Award? What's it called again? Where he used to fund like youth initiatives? I forgot what it was called now.
Is that DFE?
Yeah, not the there was an initiative where the Prince of not was it the Prince of Wales, or was it Prince Philip? One of them would fund like youth initiatives where students could launch like an initiative, and they could get funding for it, and the funding would either help it start up and grow, or if it's a failure. I like the idea of failure fund, because students should be encouraged to fail, and fail often, because it's only through those failures they learn the lessons to then persevere and create something new. Whereas if we make them terrified of failure, then they're not going to try anything, and there'll be no innovation from the younger generation.
Can I just add to that as well? So I'm a parent. I've got 2 young girls, and I think it starts at home as well. You know, again, sort of just in terms of the failure that our children experience, letting them fail. And also, I think, Aslam, what you were saying about not making this huge deal out of it, or making them feel bad because they've failed or they've made a mistake, actually being able to sort of just harness it in a way that they feel confident, because I think it really does start from the ground up. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be exploring it wider, but I think if you've got the opportunity as a parent to help shape that, that is so important too, because that's their internal voice.
I think there's something nice about the idea of a failure fund, but also like from an accounting point of view, because we are kind of bound by accountability and needing to know. I think there's something interesting about failure metrics, and I think it links to someone mentioned earlier about being scared to give answers, a wrong answer. I think it was you, Leslie. So maybe as part of the failure fund, if you're going to dip into that and use it, you need to provide like failure metrics, and the more failed things you've tried, like in Reese's case, they tried multiple things, but they should be accounted. Like, if I put in X amount of money into this failure fund, I want to see 100 recorded failures. And that kind of links to that point about, you know, you're forcing it, and you're also being encouraged to actively find failure. And it comes back to that, you know, if I'm in a classroom and ask a question, you could also apply a similar logic where you say every person in the answer, even if you don't know the answer, you've got to make up a failed answer. Even if it's just a creative answer to why this wouldn't work, that might inspire another idea. And Doug will know where I'm going with this, in the sense that I was asked to solve a medical challenge, and I didn't even look at it. I just came up with like the first thing that popped into my head as a forced failure answer in order to try and inspire some other idea in someone else, and maybe even derive the right answer in time. Yeah,
I think from
just
a lot
building on that, I just wanted to mention, like, parents, leaders, no matter who you are, you can ask people around you just one simple question: how did you fail today? Or how did you fail this week? And if it's like this, it's as easy as that. Like, if you integrate this little habit and if you start normalizing it, then people will start little by little showing up and not being afraid, right? Because so far, like, there's so many people who are even afraid to mention that.
I think just from both of those is that the value, I guess the value in failure, right, is the lesson. What are you learning? So it's whether it's in the teams, the individuals you manage, or the, you know, projects you run as organizations, is to document, okay, we tried this, we failed, and this is the number one learning outcome from that failure. And that's where the value is, and that needs to be documented. And I think, yeah, that's a lot of what I think we've all sort of talked around here, is what that lesson is, and that's what we're really after when we think about failure, right?
Is there a corollary to this that perhaps we haven't covered, which is, I guess, as leaders, are we nervous about giving feedback that it implies that the person we're speaking to has failed? And as an extension to that, though, do we need to revisit, well, what is the definition of failure? Because, yeah, if you go in and do something and it doesn't work, well, you've only failed if you then, as you say, Reese, if you don't learn something from it. But actually, if you do something, but you take away something good, positive, you learn something, oh, that happened, great. Well, actually, it doesn't sound like a failure anymore to me. So I think it's probably quite critical to be clear on, well, what do we mean by failure? You know, even if you lose the company, you know, loads of cash, well, if you get something from it, it's not going to work.
I think that's a really good, important point, Matt, and I think that's something to build on. And I also think that there's something that I wanted to touch base in terms of the great discussion so far is the type of failure. I think it depends on the career path that you have. If you've got a very high pressured environment career path, so where people's lives are at risk, medical profession, police, military, etc., I think the level of failure is a lot more severe, whereas we're talking about failure in the professional services, right? We're talking about money, assets, things like that, where failure is deemed as maybe based on profit margins, based on potentially, or repivoting a business. I think we need to explore those two options a little bit more, because I think in order to become a really good surgeon or somebody who's in the medical field, they have to fail through their exams, right? They're failed through the classroom, through practice, through getting better over time. And those people need to fail in order to get to the standards required. No different to maybe taking exams, and that's why you have mock exams, mock tests, etc., because failure is expected. So it's that expectation gap as well as you go through and as you go up the ladder, because I think there's a risk and reward matrix that goes into that as well. So, and going back to like Leslie's point around children, you know, instilling that young, I think as a society we're in a very comfortable position, particularly in the Western world, where we're no longer where we were when my parents grew up in the 1960s, 1970s, 80s, where, you know, there was a lot less opportunity than there is now. So I think that all needs to be taken into account as, you know, the youngsters take on the next generation, you know, into a much more complex world with AI, geopolitical nuances, etc. But I just wanted to kind of open the floor, and I think Matt brought a really, really good point on that. So I thought that's a good line of discussion.
Well, I mean, we only have a couple of minutes left on the call, so maybe we'll wrap it up. But this is, yeah, Doug, yeah, do you want to jump in before I wrap up? Yeah.
I was just was just going to say there's a huge range of failures. And if you get something like a social enterprise and that fails, you don't just feel that you've failed personally, you feel you've let down the people that you set it up to fail. And it's not easy to just brush that off with saying, oh, well, I learned some lessons. You know, you've still got these people in dire need and that you've failed to help. So some of it is sort of wishful thinking that you can just brush off at failure and put on a happy face. Sometimes there's really serious consequences. And surgeons, well, they're failing. You know, that can be somebody's eyesight gone. You've made somebody blind by attempting an operation that you weren't quite good enough to do. So you can't just have this happy face on, oh yeah, failure's great. Well, it depends.
And I think that's the benefit of having that ring-fenced area for it, right? Like a boundary.
Yeah.
Stefano, yeah, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, a really interesting conversation. I really believe that what you talk about, the failure matrix, is an interesting model to apply. To me, the biggest value in failing is to pass the witness to others. No, there's a social value in failing that is not absolutely celebrated enough. That value for companies or value for bigger in a bigger perspective, like we see today. How much are we learning from the mistake done from the past? Questionable. But in general, to me, there should be, again, no shame in failing, and actually the failure should be analyzed and the outcome should be put at the service of future peers, future generations, because that's instrumental. If you look at yourself as a part of a larger machine, which is, for example, a company, will benefit others. So this would be, to me, a good perspective to embed more of a failure culture into organization, a more structured way. That's why this, again, failure matrix idea, I think, is brilliant, and I would like to see it implemented one day.
Yeah, no, I agree. Is that someone wanted to speak? Or was that Stefano's kid in the background contributing? That's awesome. Incredible. Matt, I can't believe how good this conversation's been, and I wish we had more time. But like I said, this is just the start. I wanted to get this conversation rolling. And I think there's something that Matt raised that's really important as well. It's about how we as leaders communicate failure and honest feedback to people. It's not about just setting the environment for failure to thrive. It's about communication. I mean, it goes without saying. I will go away, I imagine like most of you, we'll kind of dwell on this conversation, and we can definitely pick it up, and maybe even we do a follow-up call in a week or so. But let me give that some thought. And again, please feel free to connect amongst yourselves, message me anything. I'll certainly be thinking about how we can take some tangibles away from this in terms of the failure metrics and ring-fenced areas. And just see where it goes, because the beauty about what we created at INSO is that it is a sandbox by definition, so we can play around and explore with some stuff. It feels well timed that we're about to start an INSO Reimagined series, which is centered on education, and maybe Aslan notes for us is that we focus on how do we improve failure and communication around it, the tolerance to failure, the incentives to actually fail. Maybe we can use that as a slightly more focused starting point on that, and maybe we can resource it and implement something within a school, and I don't know, there's a million and one ways we could go with this. But thank you so much, everyone. Have a fantastic rest of the day, hopefully good food for thought, and yeah, stay in touch.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.